The Exodus docked at Haifa at 4 in the afternoon on the 18th of July. As a propaganda exercise for the Jewish cause, the timing was brilliant. On the dockside, conspicuous in their civilian dress, were two members of the United Nations Committee which was shortly to report on the future of Palestine. The badly injured were carried to hospital. The bulk of the refugees were taken, acquiescent or protesting, to buildings where they were searched and deloused. The 4,500 refugees had reached the promised land, and they'd walked across about 30 feet of it. By next day, the Jews, some still struggling, had been put onto the British ships, the Runnymede Park, the Empire Rival, and the Ocean Vigor.
Two soldiers took me on the stretcher to the hospital on the ship Ocean Vigor, and then they put me on a bed. It was the first time that I laid on the bed, and there I was for 2 weeks.
You must bear in mind that they had been in very harsh conditions for a very long time, and they were emotionally keyed up, of course, with having set foot on the promised land, but they were very, very tired, and they were then embarked, and as they poured up the gangplank of my particular ship, which was the Empire Rival, I really was a bit horrified at the numbers coming on board to be faced with the accommodation which was provided.
The people from the Exodus assumed that, like other illegal immigrants, they'd simply be taken to wait in the Cyprus camps for a time and then be allowed into Palestine. But this time, the government, perhaps hoping to deter any more major attempts to run the blockade, decided on a different course. The refugees were in for a rude awakening.
Now, we went to sleep. We were exhausted from the fight, and we went to sleep, and when we got up in the morning, we all of a sudden realized that we were no way near Cyprus.
But we thought that we shall go to Cyprus because this was the usual way to be sent to the big camps in Cyprus, and suddenly after 2 days, we don't know where we are going, but we knew that we are not going to Cyprus.
I was given sealed orders just before we sailed, late that night, and I was not allowed to open these until I'd been at sea, I think it was 8 hours. And when I did open them, I found that so far from going to Cyprus, I was ordered to take the ship to Port-au-Bouc near Marseille, and there disembark them.
We lay on a steel deck, and we haven't got dresses because this little that we had was lost on the Exodus. So I had only shorts and blues, and it was summer, it was warm, but at night it was really cold, and we lay one by another, and it wasn't enough food, and the food was very bad. But it wasn't the most important thing. We didn't know what to expect.
Well, they had on our boat, they had the stern of the ship, and it was cordoned off by a thick wire mesh with a gate at each side to allow them in or out, whatever the case may be. But the conditions weren't much better, in my opinion, than they were on the boats they came over on. And we weren't much better either because we were sort of captors and captives as well.
There was quite a lot of bad feeling. You've got to realise that coming all that way and seeing Israel and Haifa, the beautiful place it is, and to realise that they're going to be turned back, and they were frustrated. We had the usual demonstrations, wouldn't eat their food, and banging with the mugs and that on the cages.
Oh, at first, yes, it was terrible. There was all sorts just come over the wires in the form of garbage and excreta and urine, all sorts, especially at night when there was usually 2 men on guard at each gate, And they creep up over the top and used to drop it over the top and that bust the lot.
It wasn't very pleasant, but it was taken in all good spirit. And like on many instances, straight away they would stand up to attention and sing their national anthem.
All sorts of queer things happened. But eventually they did get sort of friendlier. They had no choice, really, because we couldn't do anything about it, nor could they.
It was terribly hot, with children crying and shouting. It's hard now to imagine. We just got water twice a day. There was no way to wash the children. The sanitary situation was horrible. We met many cases of diarrhea. I delivered 2 babies, a boy and a girl. When I remember the conditions in which I had to do it, there was nothing to wrap the babies with. And this was till we came to Port-de-Bouc.
On the 29th of July, the refugees found themselves back where they'd started the voyage, off the coast of France.
When we arrived, we had newspapers from all over the world. They tried to reach the ships, but the British didn't let them. So they communicated with us by way of megaphones. And some French fellows we had on board, there were 25 or 30, the first thing they asked, they yelled, was who won the Tour de France, this bicycle race. Because when we took off from Sète, this Tour de France, the lap was arriving in Sète. So they were interested to know who had won the race.
The Haganah surrounded the ships in small with loudspeakers, blaring out in various languages to the Jews not to get off the ships, under no condition to get off the ships. As soon as it started, I sent a man up to the bridge to try and drown out the loudspeakers with the ship's whistle. But the Jews countered by, the Haganah countered by displaying banners in the appropriate languages, don't leave the ship.
And we asked for police patrols to stop loudspeaker boats coming around and shouting at them. None of which ever happened, of course. They all agreed, the French agreed everything, but didn't do anything.
So it was pretty well apparent that we were not going to get anybody to volunteer to leave the ship. In fact, we disembarked one old man who had a heart attack, and the Haganah on board allowed him to go. We did, in fact, reach Port-de-Bouc with one more than we left Haifa because we had a berth on board.
Well, we had two meetings, and then the French decided that they were going to make a welcoming speech to the Jews, and the prefect came around and read out a message from the French government. And immediately he'd finished speaking, he said presumably that how welcome they would be in France and all the rest of it. And it was translated by a Haganah chap who presumably told them they weren't to get off at any price. Anyway, one of the Haganah chaps leapt to his feet and made on each ship this happened, made a very fiery speech. And the prefect was quite carried away by the excitement of it all, and said, all right, we're not going to take anybody. That was really the end of the negotiations, and then I don't know what went on between London and Paris after that. We really sat in Port-de-Bouc and waited for an answer.
I came aboard on the first cargo as a translator to try to explain in a few words in Hebrew the people they should not come ashore. But I would say that it was no need to try to convince them.
People didn't want to get off to France. They wanted still to go to Israel.
Our friends from the Mossad, from the underground, from the Haganah, tried, of course, to get in touch with us, and they succeeded. They came aboard as porters of food, as doctors.
So, a friend of mine and I went as a doctor, we dressed as a doctor, and we went up to the ship, and then we saw that no one of them, of the people who want to go down, they are ready, all of them, to fight till they will come to Israel. But what the commander there, the Palmach commander from the Haganah that I met him there, what was my friend, Micha Perry, he asked me for a bomb. I asked him what for. He say that if he will see that the British push them to go down from the ship to the shore, he want to bomb the ship.
We want to go to Israel. And suddenly when the British find out that the French will not force us and will not let them to take us by force down and will not leave the ships from our will, so they decided to leave the place. And on the seashore there were a lot of newspapermen from all over the world. And the situation for the British was inconvenient.
We were hoping, of course, that we'd be allowed to put them off. And I think, in fact, if we'd got what we wanted, which was no propaganda and no contact with the outside world, I think we would have got them off. They were in quite a peaceful frame of mind and quite cheerful when we got into Port-au-Bouc. But then, of course, they got all the propaganda poured into them. And they said they weren't going to come out at any price. As we weren't allowed to move them by force, they had to stay on board.
On the 31st of July, 3 days after the arrival off Port-au-Bouc, the bodies of 2 British sergeants were found hanging from a tree near Tel Aviv. The ground beneath the corpses was booby-trapped. This action by terrorists caused anti-Jewish demonstrations in Britain and probably created more anti-Jewish feeling than anything in the unhappy history of British rule in Palestine. Ernest Bevin's next action was perhaps prompted by the hangings and the demonstrations. Already the fate of the refugees was the object of worldwide attention and wild rumours. Now, on the 21st of August, the refugees were told by the British to leave the ship or be sent to Hamburg. The decision further shocked world opinion, which with the exception of the Arab nations had been running steadily against the British in any case. Outside Palestine, the most violent anti-British demonstrations took place in the United States, where the British government were compared to the Nazis. As the deadline for disembarking approached, only about 60 of the 4,500 refugees left the transports in Port-au-Bouc, and most of them were old or sick. On the evening of August the 22nd, after more than 3 weeks at Port-au-Bouc, the 3 transport ships sailed to the country the refugees most wanted to forget, Germany.
They didn't realise until they actually got to Hamburg, even coming up the British Channel. We couldn't seem to convince them when we told them the White Cliffs of Dover. They just wouldn't accept it.
And everybody was so nervous and unhappy. And at the end, we knew that we are going to Germany, and it was the last blow.
Tempers flared, and I think only on the side of the Jews, I would like to say that the restraint shown by my soldiers was very marked. And you must remember that a number of these self-same soldiers had dropped and fought at Arnhem, and to be spat on by the Jews and called Gestapo bastards was not a very pleasant experience, but they didn't react. They took it in their stride.
The first ship that came in was the Ocean Vigor. As I say, we got jolly good relations with them, and about the first third of those came off with a bit of persuasion. And then the next 2/3 had to be manhandled off. And then the next Park, which had all the really hardcore toughies on board, that was an operation, that. Everything started coming across, tins of bully beef and boards with nails in them and everything else, how bloody works. And eventually, practically everybody had to be carried up to that ship.
My ship, the Empire Rival, was the 3rd up the Elbe to arrive and disembark at Hamburg. And when the Jews started streaming off the ship without any sort of resistance at all, I reckon that there must be some reason for this, and I suspected that they were going to leave behind a bomb.
After we put the bomb inside the ship, I didn't want the people to stay on board the ship long because I'm afraid it can blow before we thought it need to be blow. And we went quick down.
And so as soon as the holds were cleared, I went down with a party of men, and we examined a mast housing where the mast goes through the hold, and we found an inspection cover on the mast housing had been tampered with, and so I called in a naval bomb disposal squad, and they went down the hold, and they produced a large-sized bomb. It was in a 7-gallon square biscuit tin. It was only to be activated by the chemical process of the water in the bilges closing two contacts when the ship put to sea and started rolling.
Back in Germany, on familiar soil, in familiar conditions, after what the British called Operation Oasis, the refugees were put onto trains for the journey to 2 camps near the border of the British and Soviet zones.
We couldn't we couldn't believe that after so much that we went through, we are going again to Germany.
For me it was awful, since I had left in order to have my child not in Germany, but in Israel. And now the child, a girl, was born in Germany, in Lübeck.
7 weeks after the refugees had been settled in their camps, on November the 29th, 1947, the United Nations voted for the creation of an independent state in Palestine. The British opposed the United Nations vote, but 12 days later, they announced that British rule in Palestine would end on the 15th of May, 1948, the following year. The Jews had won their home.
I don't think, looking back now to those times, that it was a question of anti-Semitic or things like this. I understand that they felt they had to do a nasty and unpleasant and not human job. And the reason they did it so brutally, as far as I can think about this now, that they want to finish it quick. They want to get rid out of this job which by order they need to do, and the order was given by the British government. And we know, or I know at least, that it was a lot was involved by one man, Bevin, which he was involved personally, very strong with these problems.
It wasn't for me to criticize government policy about limiting the numbers in, but as human beings, I was frightfully sorry for them. A lot of them had very pathetic stories of ghetto in Warsaw and that sort of thing. And I think they were very nice lot, really. There were about 20 paid agitators or professional agitators on board each ship. But apart from those, the rest of them were very harmless people.
Well, my own personal feelings, I was very sorry, because it was didn't seem right that they should come out of these DP camps and sort of sail to a land that they were going to call their own, to be just captured and taken back again. It was just like Hitler's days back. I couldn't understand it. I knew that Britain, of course, had a treaty with these Arab countries, and particularly with Egypt and Palestine, to keep the Jews out, or whatever case may be. But all my sympathies were with these people, because they had no home to call their own, and no clothing anyway. And they were turned away from a land that was, I should say, respectfully theirs, in their own minds anyway, and which I think personally was theirs.
We were genuinely sorry for these poor wretches that were being shipped into the country in these illegal ships, treated like cattle. But of course there is another side to it. Our chums in the British regiments were being treated, were virtually at war with the terrorist side of the Jewish organization, the Stern Gang and the Irgun. And this also had an inevitable effect on ourselves.
Well, I think It was the most unpleasant job that I've ever had to do in the whole of my service. But I was there to carry my orders out, and my soldiers felt the same way. I think we had a great compassion for passengers in a very unfortunate predicament, but the orders were quite clear, and I had of course, no qualms or hesitation in carrying them out.
Well, we think the Exodus was the most important event on the way of the Jewish people to an independent state.
I was the commander from the Haganah on the way back. And I promised to the people that we, the Haganah, will find a way to, all of them will be back, will come to Israel. And really, after 3 months, which we were brought to Germany, the camps were empty, and all the people, we found a way to bring them to Israel. And all of them now is in the country.
Today, Venia Hadari is a professor of nuclear physics. Mika Perry is one of Israel's leading civil engineers. Noah Klieger is a journalist on a daily newspaper. Deborah Zuckerfein is a children's doctor. Braka Micheli runs her own beauty parlor. Ike Aran owns a shipping company. His first command, the Exodus, lies on the seabed near Haifa. The old ship caught fire on the 26th of August 1952 and burned beyond repair.
The most difficult problem the refugees faced was where to go. In 1945, as in Hitler's day, no Western democracy would offer asylum to Jewish refugees. The road to freedom, unbelievably, led back to Germany, the country that had perpetrated the genocide of the Jewish people. Here they found themselves in refugee camps adjacent to the infamous Nazi concentration camps. Realizing that they could not go on, they firmly demanded that the British government open the gates of Palestine. The Jews pinned great hopes on Britain's new Labour government. It was the new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, who had proposed earlier that all Palestine become a Jewish state, and his Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, was likewise an avowed friend of the Zionist movement. But when the cabinet convened at 10 Downing Street to reconsider the Palestine question, it turned out, to the great shock and disappointment of the Jews, that the Labour Party abandoned its pro-Zionist line. This reversal of policy occurred through the advice of pro-Arab experts in the Foreign Office.
To put it very simply, I think our advice was that for Britain to be responsible for creating a Jewish state in the Middle East would do severe and perhaps irreparable damage to our relations with the Arab states.
The Jews of Palestine reacted bitterly and angrily. Crowds of young people took to the streets of Tel Aviv, firmly resolved to resist and fight Britain's policy. At the same time, the Jews started a second front across the Atlantic. American Jews converged on Washington, seeking to recruit the new President Harry Truman to their cause. It was Truman who took the first step in a series of measures which 2 years later would bring about the establishment of the State of Israel.
I got a letter off to Attlee and told him that we ought to start as fast as we could to repatriate as many of the Jews as we could in Israel.
British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin responded to President Truman's appeal by convening an Anglo-American inquiry commission. These pictures show the beginning of the end of the British presence in Palestine.
It happened when the British government decided to submit the Palestine question to the United Nations.
His Majesty's government in the United Kingdom, having submitted the problem of Palestine to the United Nations, I desire on their behalf to express their appreciation of the manner in which this Special Assembly has devoted time and effort to devising this first step towards the solution of the problem.
What was Britain's true position in 1947? In Jerusalem, Mandate authorities carried on business as usual, as if they were prepared to continue ruling Palestine for another 50 years. Political observers speculated that Britain had passed the problem to the United Nations not in order to find solutions, but rather in order not to find one, relying on the Soviet Union, which at that time was vetoing all Western initiatives.
Now, I call on the delegate of Soviet Union. Maintenant la parole au délégué de l'Union soviétique.
Господин председатель, то обстоятельство, что ни одно западноевропейское государство не оказалось в состоянии обеспечить защиту элементарных прав еврейского народа, объясняет стремление евреев к созданию своего...
Andrei Gromyko's speech was the greatest surprise of the Assembly session. The representative of the Soviet Union, the historic enemy of the Zionist movement, spoke of the right of the Jewish people to independence, thus removing the main obstacle on the path towards the State of Israel. On February the 1st, a booby-trapped car destroyed the building of the Palestine Post, an English-language Jewish newspaper. 3 weeks later, Jewish Jerusalem was shaken once again by an explosion on Ben Yehuda Street in the center of the city. More than 50 bodies were pulled out of the rubble. This disaster, perpetrated by pro-Arab British deserters, intensified the crisis in Jewish-British relations. The recurring question was, where exactly does Britain stand? Government House continued to manage the affairs of the country. However, the High Commissioner, Sir Alan Cunningham, complained that during the final months of his term of office, he was compelled to maintain control without a clear policy from London. Sir Alan therefore continued to go about his daily routine. In January 1948, he participated in a ceremonial bestowal of honours. This strange event took place while only a short distance away. The Arabs and Jews were killing each other, and as His Majesty's forces were observing the events from a standpoint of neutrality. The Jews complained that neutrality usually worked against them. Until the very last day of the British Mandate, the Royal Air Force did not cease pursuing the dilapidated ships laden with Jewish refugees sailing towards the shores of Palestine. But while hunting down illegal immigrants in order to deport them to internment camps in Cyprus, they tolerated the infiltration of Arab volunteers and mercenaries across Palestine's borders. The Arabs no longer bothered to conceal their forces in the hills. They even invited reporters and photographers to observe their maneuvers. Britain uttered mild protests over the presence of a foreign army in the country, yet took no action to remove it from the area, as she did not wish to spoil her relations with the Arab states. On January the 10th, an Anglo-Iraqi pact was signed by British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin. Bevin visualized Britain playing a major role in the Middle East. Hence the official announcements that Britain had decided to leave Palestine met with considerable skepticism.
The people in the Foreign Office, I don't suppose there was unanimous advice, there never is, but those people who gave that advice, I'm sure, were influenced by their judgment that the Arabs would win the subsequent war, with a very complex feeling. But part of it was, well, hell, we can't prevent these fellows fighting one another. I mean, we'd only get a lot of British soldiers killed in between Arabs and Jews and things, and very likely it will be settled by the Arabs winning, but even if it isn't, we can't stay there. It was largely an act of impotence.
The impression that the Arabs had the upper hand was strengthened on March the 1st, when they succeeded in planting a booby-trapped car at the Jewish Agency building. This was the best guarded spot in all Jewish Jerusalem. It is difficult to imagine how poorly armed the Jews were in those days. In the eyes of the British, these weapons were of course illegal, so they had to be stored in underground hideouts. Not only Britain, but even the United States and all other Western countries imposed an embargo on arms to the Middle East. Salvation came in March 1948 from an unexpected source. Czechoslovakia, acting on Moscow's orders, supplied an arms shipment of unprecedented size, which enabled the Jews to launch their first offensive, aimed at breaking Abd al-Qadir's siege of Jerusalem. On April 16th, the United States called for a special session of the UN General Assembly.
The United States would heartily support.
The Americans indeed sought to replace the partition of Palestine with a UN trusteeship, meaning simply to prevent Jewish independence.
Can be found to support them.
It is somewhat ironic to note that the Soviet delegation headed by Andrei Gromyko came to the UN with instructions from Stalin to support the Jewish state.
Позиция Соединенных Штатов, как она изложена в только что представленных нам предложениях, она является логическим продолжением той позиции, которую Соединенные Штаты проводили с самого начала консультаций между постоянными членами Совета Безопасности.
The British administration will leave Jerusalem within a fortnight, and very shortly afterwards, the last of the British troops will be out of Jerusalem.
Whatever the outcome of the UN decision, the British had made up their minds to leave Palestine. They dismantled military bases and installations, leaving them to be seized by the Jews or the Arabs, mainly the Arabs. Several units bid farewell to the population with parades. This was another strange, surrealistic scene, as war raged all about and people were being killed. Britain was departing, leaving behind a vacuum. Palestine was the only British-administered area in which government was not transferred in an orderly fashion to the local inhabitants. The Jews, for their part, followed the British departure attentively and skeptically, preparing to declare their independence as soon as the High Commissioner would leave Palestine and the mandate expired. On May the 14th, at 8 in the morning, the High Commissioner, Sir Alan Cunningham, reviewed a guard of honor at Government House in Jerusalem. Several hours later, at the port of Haifa, Sir Alan watched the lowering of the flag for the last time. Only a few people observed this ceremony, which marked the end of Britain's 30 years in the Holy Land.